Hello, this is Maria Williams. In today's video, I'll show you how I made this trifold card that has an acetate front with Altenew's beautiful, brilliant baubles, stamps, and dies. These are a wonderful set, and I will give you some tips for how to use them along the way. This is the original card that I made and posted on Instagram and on the blog. And the card that I'm making today is essentially the same, except that I didn't take the time to back all the ornaments with stamped ornaments as well. I just left them blank, and it saves a pretty good amount of time. So I think it's worth it to do the simplified version. This is definitely not a card that you would want to mass produce, but even if you were just making one, I think it looks good without adding the stamped ornaments on the back. So here are the Altenew Brilliant Baubles, dies, and stamps. And I wanted to show you that within the stamp packaging, you get this little brochure that has 4 card ideas, 4 different ways that you can use the stamps. And it gives you the color combinations, and it also gives you a very detailed guide of how to layer the stamps. I'm also using for the first time Altenew inks. I have 3 sets: Deep Blue Seas, Red Sunset, and Green Fields. And I will have all the links to all these products on my blog, so check it out for that. And let's get started with the card. I have already set up all my stamps on the Misti. These are the first steps of every one of the 6 ornaments that come in the set. But before I do any stamping, I am going to die cut the ornaments out of some scratch pieces of cardstock so that I can use them with my Misti to do my layers later on. I'm going to mark the front part of each one of the pieces of cardstock with an asterisk so that I know exactly which side is up when I get ready to do my stamping. Next, I'm going to take a sheet of Neenah Solar White. This is 80 pound, and I'm going to cut it in half at the 4 1/4 inch mark, and then I'm going to cut both of those pieces down to about 6 1/2 inches so that they will fit in my Misti. You'll see at the top of the screen that I have arranged my inks into sets. So I've taken the lightest ink from each one of the sets and put them together, and then the medium ones, and then the next one up. I'm only going to be using 3 of the shades out of the 4. And then because I'm using ink spots, I can easily ink up 2 ornaments at a time without getting ink on the other ones. I could have gone ahead and inked all 6 of them up at the same time, but I decided to do 2 at a time just to make sure that things didn't get out of control. And this is my second time inking these up. So before I used them the very first time, I did ink them up with Versamark ink and then wiped it off, because this is something that you can do to make sure that your very solid stamps accept the ink a little bit better. So if you find that you stamp for the first time and you're not getting a great image, clean it off, clean the stamp off, ink it up with Versamark, and just kind of wipe it off with your finger, and then apply your regular ink again and see if you get a better result. As you can see, I'm getting pretty solid images, but if I didn't, I could always double stamp, which I did double stamp the blue. I didn't feel like that was a good enough impression, even though I was going to be layering. So I went ahead and stamped those 2 ornaments again. When I was done stamping all the ornaments, I simply removed this piece of cardstock and put in the other piece of cardstock that is the same size, and did exactly the same thing. Once I was done stamping all the ornaments on the 2 pieces of cardstock, I took the dies, lined them up, and I secured them in place using a little bit of washi tape. And at this point, I could have gone ahead and put my 2 pieces of cardstock together before running it through my Big Shot, but what I ended up doing is I ran 1 piece of cardstock through, and then removing the die cuts, and then aligning the piece of cardstock with the die cuts already cut out, and the piece that was still whole, lining them up one on top of the other and running that through my Big Shot. For the second layer of stamping, I'm using my Misti once again. So I have put the second layer of stamps all in a row at the top there, and using the ink spots, I am stamping the images, and then I'm going to take those pieces of cardstock that I die cut earlier. I'm going to line them up with the images very carefully, and then what I will be able to do is insert my die cuts into the openings, and I know that I will get the second layer perfectly stamped on top of the first one. When I was putting my die cuts into the openings, I did realize that the ornament that's all the way on the left was supposed to be stamped in pink. So I just cleaned off the stamp, and no worries, I just have to stamp 2 of the ornaments with pink this time. I hadn't put any Versamark on these stamps before I used them. This was the first time I was using them, and so I didn't get great impressions the first time. So I did end up double stamping these, but as you can see, because I was using the Misti, I got perfect impressions on both of the ornaments. And then for the blue one, I only had to stamp it once. One of the ornament has two sections that look almost identical, and I thought about lining them up and stamping them at once, but I wasn't sure that I could really get everything lined up as perfectly as I wanted to. So I decided to put the two pieces a little bit away from each other, leave enough distance that I could stamp each one of the images individually. So I mounted the stamps onto the door of the Misti, inked them up, and stamped onto my scratch piece of paper. And then I lined up my template with the top part, put my die cut in, stamped that, and then removed the die cut, put my template onto the lower part, and then stamped that. For this next ornament, you could definitely stamp this without the Misti, and this is what I did later, but I did want to show you this technique for getting something lined up. I have already placed my die cut inside the die cut template onto my Misti, and I've already lined up the stamp. I've eyeballed it with the center of the ornament. So then I'm taking my grid sheet that I had printed on acetate at my local office supply store and stamping onto it. Then I can check it out and make sure that it is definitely stamped in the center of my ornament, and then remove the grid sheet, ink up my stamp, and stamp it down. And as you can see, you get everything perfectly centered. If it wasn't centered, I would just need to adjust my placement of my ornament a little bit underneath the acetate and stamp again. For the third layer of this ornament, I once again used my Misti and stamped the detail onto a scratch piece of paper, aligned my die cut template with it, and then inserted my die cut. I also used my Misti to stamp the layers on the two ornaments that are to the left of where I'm stamping now. But for these teardrop shaped ornaments, I thought it would be easiest to just stamp everything freehand. So that's what I'm doing here. This is layer number 2. And then I am just changing ink colors to the darkest shade of blue that I'm using, and then stamping that freehand as well. So I think by now you've seen enough of the stamping, but I did want to show you one more thing. I stamped these two ornaments freehand, and when I stamped the first one, I had not used Versamark on my stamp. So the first one is stamped without coating the stamp with Versamark, and the second one, as you can see here, I'm coating with Versamark ink and wiping it off with my finger, and then I'm inking it up and then stamping. And here's the difference. The one on the left is the one that I stamped without the Versamark, and the one on the right is the one that I stamped with the Versamark. With all the ornaments completed, it's time to move on to the ornament hangers. I'm going to emboss these in gold, but I need to know how many I need of each, so I'm checking my chart that came with the stamp set to see how many, see which hanger I need for which ornament. So I've determined that I need 4 large ones and 2 small ones. So I'm taking a piece of, again, Nina 80-pound cardstock, prepping it with my anti-static tool, and using Versamark ink to stamp all the hangers. Then I add some gold embossing powder and get my heat tool and carefully heat it all up. The die set also has dies to cut these hangers out, so I'm going to do that next. And this is a little bit tedious because they are so small, but they do die cut really well and come out of the dies really easily. So, but this is one of the reasons why I decided not to use ornaments on the back of the front of the card. You can see all my die cut pieces on the right there, and now I'm going to prepare my card base. I'm making my card base out of Bristol smooth white cardstock. It's a little bit longer than Nina Solar White, and it's also sturdier. So I'm cutting a piece of cardstock that is 4 1/4 inches wide, which is the standard height of an A2 card, and then I'm going to score it at 5 1/2 inches, which is also standard size card base, and you'll see that I have a little bit of extra. So I'm just putting it into my mini trimmer and trimming that extra piece off. And then I'm going to take a piece of acetate that I have cut down to 4¼ by 6 inches, and I'm going to line it up with my cardstock, and then I'm going to put it with the acetate. Actually, I think I sandwiched the acetate in between the cards so that it wouldn't move in between the two pieces, and then I scored the acetate. You could just do this with the piece of acetate, but I found that having the cardstock there prevented the acetate from sliding around and ensured that I had a straight line and that it matched the cardstock perfectly. My acetate is really thick. I got this years and years ago, so unfortunately I'm not sure what the brand is. If you are using the acetate that is heat resistant, I think it's the Judikins one that I have used on occasion. It's not as thick as this, so it probably wouldn't take as much effort to score it, but I did score it on one side and then flip it, fold it over, and score it again. I'm going to stamp the sentiment onto the acetate. So I've already set it up. This is my Stampin' Up! Stamp positioner, and I have already put my stamp in it, and I'm prepping the acetate by using my powder embossing buddy. The name was escaping me. So I'm using my embossing buddy heavily onto my acetate because it can be really staticky. And then I'm inking up the stamp with Versamark ink and stamping it onto the acetate. I take a really good look at the acetate to make sure that the stamp is perfect, and then I take my gold embossing powder and cover the stamped area. Then I'm going to take my embossing tool, my heat tool, and very carefully heat this up. Now the key is to sort of do bursts of heat onto the stamped area. If you hold it on the acetate, it'll warp completely. I actually have not been able to get a perfectly straight piece of acetate when I've heat embossed it, but I have been able to get just a little bit of warping by putting the heat on and taking it off and putting the heat on and taking it off, and you just kind of have to be patient with it. I'm not speeding up this part of the video at all so that you can see it in real time. As you can see, it did warp a little bit, but by the time you add it to the card and then put it in an envelope, it will flatten out a little bit more. I've cleaned my panel with a barely damp piece of chamois, and then I'm drying it off with some paper towel. I'm being very gentle because my particular acetate tends to scratch very easily. And then I'm going to prepare the rest of my card base. I'm using Gold Delicata ink. It's a little bit sparkly, and unfortunately in the pictures and maybe even in the video you can't appreciate the shimmer that you get with it, but it is nice and shimmery, and I'm trying to put the ink in the areas where the ornaments are not going to be. So I'm using one of these Ranger inking tools, and I'm taking a piece of scratch paper, just some printer paper, and placing it underneath my card just to make sure that my surface stays clean. And then I'm just using a light hand and inking up my tool and using a swirling motion to get the ink spread out onto my card base. Because Delicata ink is a pigment ink, it does take a little bit of time to dry, so I'm going to set my card base aside and go back to my acetate panel. On my original card, I used liquid glue to attach the ornaments to the acetate panel, but because I'm not going to be covering up the backs of the ornaments, I wanted to make sure that I didn't see, you know, squiggly lines of glue. I wanted the backs of the ornaments to look as neat as possible. So I decided to use this Xyron sticker machine that I've had for a really long time, and I was a little worried that the larger ornament wouldn't fit, but it fit just fine. So I'm just feeding all my ornaments in to make them all into stickers. And I will use a bone folder to kind of burnish the ornaments and make sure that the glue is only going to stick to the ornaments. Sometimes you can get a little bit of extra glue peeling up when you peel off the clear strip. So it's a good idea to kind of use a bone folder or, you know, something that's a little bit sharp to kind of burnish around the items that you're trying to turn into stickers. I'm using the same layout as for the original card, so I'm just kind of setting up the ornaments around the sentiment. And in my original card, on one of the green ornaments, I didn't stamp one of the medium. I didn't stamp the medium layer, and so in this particular card, I ended up with two ornaments that were exactly the same colors and shades right next to each other, which I didn't in the original card. But anyway, I think it still looks okay. But had I realized beforehand, I would have separated those two green ones. Here's a quick look at the back of the card, and once I press them all a little bit more firmly into place, the glue will be even less apparent. Next, I'm adding the little ornament hangers, and I was having trouble seeing on the black surface, so I just taped my acetate panel to a piece of white paper just so I could see a little bit better. There's a stamp in the Brilliant Baubles stamp set to stamp the line, like the cord for the ornament. So I have set it up in my Stampin' Up! Stamparatus, and I'm inking it up with StazOn ink and stamping it onto my grid paper just to make sure that it's nice and straight. And then I'm going to take my panel and line up the ornaments so that they sit just below the last dot on the string stamp. And then I can just ink it up, close my lid, and I get a perfect impression. And then I can continue to do this all the way down the line until I've done the strings for all the ornaments. And if I make a mistake, all I have to do is take a cotton ball or a paper towel, moisten it with alcohol, and wipe it off, and I can start over. To attach my acetate panel to the rest of the card base, I'm using some score tape. It's the kind that says Sukwang on it. I think it might be sold under different brand names. And I'm putting the tape onto the back of the card, the inside of the back of the card, aligning the acetate with the middle part of the card, and then closing it so that I get perfect alignment. I didn't want this to show, so I used a scallop die. I have two different ones, and I used the different ones for the two different cards, and cut a strip of gold foil cardstock and just attached it with another strip of score tape. I cut it a little bit taller than my card base, so I centered it onto the card and then trimmed off the edges with my scissors. And that finished off the card. Now, in the card that I showed on Instagram, I did put a family photo in there, and yes, this is a pretty old photo, but you could take any photo that you want and line it up inside and tape it down, and then take another one of the ornaments and glue it onto the photo. And then I wouldn't worry about stamping the string. I would just take a black marker and do a dotted line. So that's it for this card. Here's another look at the original card with the ornaments on the inside of the panel as well, and the new card without. So you either judge whether you have to have the ornaments or not, but this definitely saves a lot of time. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and for links to all the supplies, please visit my blog. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day. For links to the products I used and still shots, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com.